guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched WandaVision episode 4. Let's talk about it. So I wholeheartedly believe that WandaVision episode 4 was for all of the naysayers, okay? All of those who weren't on board with the mystery of the show, with the sitcom elements of the show. You guys who just weren't convinced by the premise of this series. This episode was for you because everything has come together now. Everything is starting to make sense and I am so happy to report, okay? I am so happy to tell you that a lot of what I predicted, a lot of what I said was going to happen or was happening in the series was right. Can you imagine? Can you imagine my delight, my happiness, my sheer joy as I watched this episode unfold and I was proven right time and time and time again. Now there were a couple of things, okay? There were a couple of things that I may not have been correct about and we'll talk about that later on in the review. But other than those few things, I have to admit, even if I am tooting my own horn, that my Sherlock skills are legit. Like my Sherlocking skills are legit. I could definitely replace Benedict Cumberbatch in the next Sherlock series if there ever is one, because I'm picking up what they're putting down and I'm so proud of myself. But now let's move on to the things that actually happened in this episode, because it was just jam-packed full of clues, okay, full of answers to the questions that we had, and it also raised a ton more questions for us to be asking throughout the entirety of this series going on. But before we dive into my thoughts on episode 4 of WandaVision, as always, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Without further ado now, let's get into this. So first off, episode 4 starts off with one of the most emotionally impactful, poignant moments in the entire MCU. It was such an emotional scene to start off this episode with, and it was so cleverly done as well. The execution was so clever because at first we're kind of confused. We don't quite understand what's going on because last time we saw Monica Rambeau, she was of course yeeted outside of Wanda's, parallel universe or the dimension that she's created. So we're left wondering what is going on at the beginning, like what is happening to her, what are these particles on her face? Perhaps it's her powers that are manifesting, the powers that she has from the comics as Photon. There's so many questions going on, but then you hear in the background the voices of the characters from Captain Marvel, including Captain Marvel herself and Maria Rambeau, her mother, and a young Monica Rambeau who was also in the film. So it's all kinds of comes together at that point, but still I'm a bit confused. But it was only when I saw the sheer chaos, the madness of people reappearing out of nowhere. All of a sudden the hospitals are full up because you have patients who disappeared like 5 years ago. They're reappearing in the middle of these wards, and the chaos is just what reminded me of this huge occasion that has happened in the MCU, which was of course the blip, the snappening, whatever you want to call it. But this time around we got to see for the first time, I believe, the real consequences. It was such a sobering moment to be standing there in the middle of a hospital, one of the places that would have the most severe consequences of the snappening, and just seeing the chaos that it created, the confusion, the sadness and the mourning that it must have created, seeing the frantic panic in these people's eyes, especially that doctor who was kind of running around looking for his wife. It was just so heartbreaking, and it really did bring home how destructive Thanos' actions were to the MCU, to the entire universe. But then it gets worse because we learn that Monica was actually there in that hospital 5 years ago because her mother had recovered from cancer and she was ready to take her home. Only because she was snapped out of existence because of Thanos, she wasn't able to do so. So her mother ended up, living another 2 years before the cancer came back. The cancer came back and she ended up dying during the 5 years that Monica had disappeared. And so when Monica wakes up, the first news that she hears is that her mother is dead, not because of the cancer that she got the first time around, but because of the cancer that came back afterwards. She wasn't even able to spend the 2 additional years of life that Maria had. That scene is so heartbreaking. I was like, what is going on? What is literally happening right now? I think Teyonah Parris did such an incredible job acting that scene out because it was just so emotionally impactful again. Now, whilst I do think that that opening sequence in episode 4 of WandaVision was truly touching, truly just phenomenal, so well done, and I think it definitely, you know, raises the stakes when it comes to emotional moments in this series and perhaps even in the MCU overall. However, it wouldn't be me if I didn't mention that because of this scene, you know, because of the events that unfold here, we have lost one of the few one of the few active, okay, present black female characters in the MCU. I really enjoyed Maria Rambeau. I think she was one of the best parts. Her and Ben Mendelsohn's character were one of the best parts of Captain Marvel, and after having rewatched that film, I realized just how important the relationship that Maria Rambeau had with Carol Danvers was. Like, it really does anchor the film in a way that a love interest would in another film. You know, she really is an important part of Carol Danvers' backstory. So to see her go in this way off screen, I don't know how I feel about that. I think it's a shame because once again, she was one of the first prevalent black female characters that we got in the MCU, and that was only in 2019. So we don't need to talk about that right now, but I was a bit upset to see her go, especially because I would have liked to see at least one scene with her daughter who she's passing on the torch to. So hopefully we will get to see her in some flashbacks and perhaps Captain Marvel too. Maybe they'll introduce more shorts or something and we'll get to see her in them, especially because we're dealing with Lashana Lynch here. We can't be wasting, oh my god, we can't be wasting another great actor like Lashana Lynch. Like, we need to stop this, Marvel. So I hope that they bring her back in some capacity, because I just think she's too good of a character to sacrifice in this way, even if it did make for an incredibly impactful opening sequence for episode 4. Now, the rest of episode 4 reveals to us the events that have occurred in the first 3 episodes, only this time through the perspective of the S.W.O.R.D agents, because yes, it is confirmed that S.W.O.R.D is involved in this, as we saw in previous episodes where there was the S.W.O.R.D symbol on various things. After the opening scene, we do see Monica head towards the S.W.O.R.D headquarters, only to find out that her keycard isn't working because she no longer has access as someone who disappeared for 5 years. So she happens to stumble into Tyler Hayward, who is the acting director of S.W.O.R.D for now, and he seems to know a lot about Maria's intentions and what she had planned for S.W.O.R.D and Monica specifically. He stumbles into her and is able to allow her access into the building, where they're talking a lot about the purpose of S.W.O.R.D and how that has changed in the last 5 years since Monica has disappeared. What's really interesting is that in my last review of last week's episode, I did mention how the acronym for S.W.O.R.D had changed its meaning in the MCU, where all of a sudden they're looking at sentient weapons as opposed to sentient worlds. And it seems as though that in this world, in this context, they did perhaps look at sentient worlds beforehand. They're focused on weaponry now instead of exploring other planets and threats on other planets, and Tyler explains that that's mostly because of the Snappening and how half of their workforce automatically disappeared, and also because the other half, you know, a lot of them were really frightened after what had happened, which makes complete sense. Like, here in the beginning of this episode, you're starting to see the real life implications of what Thanos did, you know, how that would affect everyday people. People are terrified. You know, who's signing up to join S.W.O.R.D after they've literally seen half of their loved ones disappear, like half of their families disappear within seconds, and have had to live with that for 5 years, to live with that trauma, with that, you know, PTSD, with the mourning, with the loss for 5 years. Who's going to be signing up to go to S.W.O.R.D? No one. So of course everyone's just going to be dealing with, you know, small missing persons cases and stuff like that, because anything more would just be traumatic. Like, no one wants to go into space right now. That's the last place you want to be. So I love the fact that this episode explores the real world implications of what has happened in the MCU, because I feel like the films have not done quite a good enough job of doing so, although there haven't been many films that have taken place after the Snappening. Of course, the last one that we saw was Spider-Man Far From Home, and that didn't really deal with that in a lot of depth, at least not in a way that explored the sad side of things, the pathos that would really include. Now, whilst those 5 years where people had completely disappeared must have been really difficult for those who had stayed behind, for example in the case of Maria Rambeau, who still had to run S.W.O.R.D during that time, that didn't mean that Maria wasn't thinking ahead, because she did have hope that one day her daughter would return, which again I just find so touching, and I wish we could have seen Lashana Lynch act that out, but whatever, we need to move on. She did have hope that her daughter would return one day, and she did bring about protocols in that instance that should her daughter return, she would be grounded. She would be grounded. She wouldn't be able to to, you know, go into intergalactic travel or anything of the sort. So she would basically be grounded in terms of not being able to fly, but also in terms of like her being her mom and telling her she's grounded. Like, you're staying there, you're grounded, okay? Which I find adorable. As a result of being grounded, Monica is essentially demoted. She's forced to do some grunt work and check out this missing persons case along with FBI's Jimmy Woo. So she heads over to Jersey, and lo and behold, here we have, first of all, the introduction of Jimmy Woo into this series and into this franchise, and he introduces himself with a magic trick that is a direct callback to his appearance in Ant-Man and the Wasp, where Scott was doing all these magic tricks because he was stuck at home. Jimmy was just so curious about how Scott was able to do those tricks, so I was just so happy to see that he had learned it. I was so happy to see that there was this like whole character arc that had taken place off screen, and we also see that in the case of another character who makes an appearance after an even longer break from the MCU, Darcy. Now, we'll talk about Darcy later on, but just in terms of character arcs that occurred off screen, Darcy is no longer just Miss Darcy, okay, Miss Lewis. She's now Dr. Lewis, which means she's been doing her homework off screen. She's been doing the schooling, she's been getting the education. She is now a qualified astrophysicist to the point where she would be called in to check out this phenomenon that's happening right now. But I just found it to be quite nice. Like, it was quite nice to see this character who was there at the genesis of the MCU. So pay her respect. She was there at the very beginning. I think she was deserving to have this reappearance here, and I love the fact that she's elevated herself. Like, she's continued on with her studies, she's gotten that doctorate, and I think it's just such a great character progression to happen for a D-list character, let's be real, a D-list character in the MCU. So when Monica does meet Jimmy, he kind of fills her in on what's been happening in this small town, and the first thing that I saw in this whole scene was that Westview sign during the day, and that's when I said yes. Yes, I was right. I was right. I promise you, I'm not going to be tooting my own horn the whole video, but I was right. I was right when I said last week that Westview is a real place. It is a real town with real residents who have been taken under the control of Wanda. I felt so vindicated when I saw that sign, because it pretty much confirms that. And as Jimmy Woo explains, you see these sheriffs standing outside of the town, and they don't seem to know about any Westview town. Like, they seem to think that they're from Eastview, which I think is this kind of collective amnesia that's taken place that Wanda must have imposed on them so that they wouldn't check out or investigate the town right behind them, like literally right behind them. And the show even makes a point to highlight the fact that they're saying this while standing next to a sign that says Westview. So perhaps they see the sign and they think it says Eastview because they've been hexed. But either way, I just love that confirmation that we got, because it does mean that these townspeople are actual people who have been kidnapped essentially by Wanda in order to fill up this fictional town, this illusion that she has created for herself. Unfortunately, in order for the plot to progress, Monica had to go and do something dumb. Like, she had to go and do something stupid by touching the energy field that surrounds Westview, and therefore ending up in that town and under the control of Wanda herself. Now, I speculated in last week's episode that Monica had some idea of what was going on and that she had been sent in to investigate Westview as a whole, and because she was aware that Wanda actually was there and was actually taking control of the situation, or perhaps she thought that someone else was controlling Wanda. But in actuality, this episode reveals that she had no idea that Wanda was involved here, and she just discovered that Wanda was there when she entered herself. So it's really interesting to me to see that S.W.O.R.D really did know nothing. Like, they knew nothing. Like, I thought at least they knew that Wanda was inside it and they were trying to get her, but no, they had no idea. They had less of a clue than we did going into the series, which I found very interesting. After Monica ends up inadvertently becoming one of the townspeople of Westview, Jimmy Woo is freaking out. He's like, oh my goodness, I've sent her to her death. And so a whole task force is formed with all of these acronyms involved. Okay, we've got the CIA, we've got the FBI, we've got S.W.O.R.D. Everyone's involved to try and find out what's going on, and of course to retrieve the S.W.O.R.D agent. And we have the introduction of Darcy in this franchise and in this show, which I was so happy about. Like I said, this is a character who's been there since almost day one, since the first Thor film, almost day one. So she deserves her respect, and I'm glad to see that she had that off-screen glow up. And she's even been called in by all of these acronyms to take a look at this phenomena that's happened in New Jersey. And it makes complete sense, taking into account the experience that Darcy has, especially in the case of Thor 2, The Dark World, where we got a lot of dimension hopping in that film. Like, that film is just so trippy. That film, go back and rewatch that film. That film is crazy. But then we got a lot of dimension hopping in that case, and I think having Darcy present here kind of ties that storyline, ties that element of the MCU directly into WandaVision to kind of shorthandedly explain what might be going on here. And later on in the episode, Darcy even says that she's registering some CMBR waves that's coming from the dome, and Tyler Hayward later on in the episode mentions that that is the energy that stems from the Big Bang, which tells me that Infinity Stones are involved. This tells me that Wanda is using her powers, which stem from an Infinity Stone, to create this dimension, one. And two, what's very interesting is that does this mean that this dimension that Wanda is creating is just as valid as the actual universe? Because if she's using energy that comes from the Big Bang, which created a whole universe, like a real universe, then this dimension could end up being a pocket universe, just as valid as the universe that exists within. I find that to be very fascinating, and it also means that this isn't just an illusion, like she's actually creating a new world for her to exist in with Vision, which that takes out an entirely different power set, and I think that's really interesting. That seems to be what they're hinting at. And not only that, but Jimmy Woo even says, you know, that perhaps this could expand, perhaps this could even get bigger to the extent that it would take over everything that's surrounding it. And I find it very, very interesting, you know, skipping back and forth for a bit here, I find it interesting that when Monica escapes or is yeeted out of Wanda's dimension, she's still dressed the way that she was within the dome. Like, she's still dressed in her 1970s clothing, which is interesting because when things come from the outside into the dome, they change into, you know, whatever aesthetic of the week that Wanda is trying to emanate. So it's really interesting to me that Monica didn't change back into the clothes that she had when she was in the outside world. Does this mean that if this dome starts to expand further, it could consume everything? And we are starting to see this is so many things linked together, but we are starting to see that the world that Wanda has created is becoming larger, it's becoming more complex. If you think back to the first episode where we were just pretty much confined to her living room, and there was a small set where it was supposed to be, you know, Vision's workplace, but it wasn't that complex, it was pretty rudimentary. But then as the decades have gone on, meaning as the episodes have gone on, the sets have become more complex, as we would have seen reflected in real life TV, but also it might be a reflection of how Wanda's world is becoming more complex and larger and perhaps potentially growing. But the CMBR waves weren't the only thing that Darcy was able to detect, which, by the way, Darcy was doing so much of the heavy lifting for this investigation. Like, what was everyone else doing? They were sending in drones unsuccessfully, and I do believe that those drones, the several drones that came into the dome, were the noises that Wanda and Vision had been hearing in episode 2, at the beginning of episode 2, where they were frightened. I do believe that every single drone that went into that dome ended up making that thudding noise, and you do hear a bit of an echo of that thudding noise in this episode. So again, this is another prediction that I made correctly, so pat myself on the back for that one as well. But anyways, I find it interesting how everyone else was pretty much slacking, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, you know, insanity. But in the case of Darcy, she was on it from the very beginning, even though no one gave her the coffee that she asked for, and she was able to detect some other radio waves on top of the CMBR waves, and which led her to the television very quickly and conveniently, but whatever. It led her to the television where she was able to see WandaVision. Like, she was able to watch WandaVision in the way that you and I have, which was a clever little touch that the show added in there. I think it was weird. It was very meta. This entire episode was very meta to see the characters of WandaVision, who happen to be outside of Wanda's vision, watching WandaVision. Like, there was so many layers of meta commentary there, which was cute. It was fun. I did also enjoy the little commentary that Darcy and the gang had about TV shows, and talking about the casting, talking about the speaking role that Monica had all of a sudden, which we'll talk about in a second. But I just think it was a fun way of tying in the sitcom show premise into every single aspect of this series. But it was still weird to see them watching the show that we have been watching for the last 3 episodes, only this time it had a certain eeriness to it. Like, it felt like watching someone who was trapped, as opposed to engaging in this, you know, fun sitcom romance that we had been having a fun time with previously. This time around, it didn't feel right. There was something so off, and seeing Darcy watch them, seeing Darcy essentially watch Wanda's mental breakdown, if you think about it, I couldn't quite get into it in the way that Darcy was when she was watching the show herself. But soon after Darcy does make that discovery that all of the people that appear on this show are the actual residents of Westview, they start making this entire kind of map, this entire board made up of the identities of all of the missing people from the town. We do see, interestingly enough, that under Agnes, there is no ID present there. So I do believe that Agnes, Agatha Harkness, as we've already established at this point, is someone who wouldn't really have her ID lying around. Like, perhaps she's not registered with anything because she's an immortal being in the comics who stems from the times of the Salem witch trials. So she's not putting her ID everywhere, okay? She's staying off the grid. So it makes sense that they wouldn't be able to find her identity or her information on that front. And I also find it interesting that Dottie is missing from this board as well, although at this point I believe they've only watched one episode, so perhaps they hadn't really taken her into account yet because she only makes an appearance in episode 2. But once again, seeing those faces on the board, the faces of real life people who have been snatched out of their real existence and taken into this alternate reality where Wanda has this perfect life with Vision, it was so creepy, it was so eerie to me. I don't know how you guys felt about it, but seeing these real life people with modern day hairstyles, we didn't really get close-ups of all of them, but it just felt like these innocent people had been, you know, taken advantage of, had been forced to take part in this weird social experiment that Wanda is undergoing. Just feel like being snatched out of this world finally and taking a look at the wider, broader perspective and context of what's going on here really made me realize the severity of the fact that these people have been taken in and forced to live out this reality. And just in general, one of the major themes of this episode was getting to see the true form of the things that had been twisted, the things that had been edited in Wanda's show. So for example, of course, you have the cast of characters themselves, but then we also got to look at the helicopter at the beginning of the episode where we saw that it had actually been a drone that had been sent in by Monica, and it ended up being turned into this toy helicopter subconsciously by Wanda to exist in the, you know, wider world, the wider context of the 1960s sitcom episode. And of course, we also got to look at the beekeeper. My theory surrounding the beekeeper was that he was an AIM agent because he looked like one, but actually it turns out that he is a S.W.O.R.D agent. I could never quite figure out why an AIM agent was wearing a suit that had a S.W.O.R.D logo, but it turns out it's because he's a S.W.O.R.D agent who's been turned into a beekeeper by the time that he gets into Wanda's dimension. So it seems as though this dimension does stretch on underneath the ground as well, and so when he was creeping through the sewers, he did get affected by it, and the rope that was supposed to be, you know, tethering him to the base that they had set up in the perimeter ended up breaking and turning into a skipping rope, which was fun, I guess. And so when he does emerge from the sewers in that episode, in the second episode, we do see him in this beekeeper outfit as opposed to the kind of hazmat suit that he was wearing when he left S.W.O.R.D. It was so creepy and eerie once again to see from his perspective Wanda and Vision standing a mere meters away from him, and this is such a powerful character who looks so cold and calculating in that moment, and she's not even afraid, she's not even startled in that moment, and she says no once again. And people have pointed out that that no does sound different to the no that we heard previously. I suspect it's just because it's a different take, but maybe that is intentional within the show as well. But it was just so fascinating to see it from his perspective. I do wonder what happened to him though, because last we saw she had kind of rewound back to a better moment for herself, but we didn't actually find out what happened to the beekeeper. So who knows, he might pop up as an alternate character within the cast, or he might never pop up again. No, I do think he'll pop up again. He has to. He has to. Another piece of insight that we did get was, of course, Jimmy Woo being the one who was on the radio in episode 2 when Wanda was talking to Dottie. We see that it was actually Darcy's idea to try out, you know, the different frequency waves things, okay, science. She tried something out and basically was able to intercept the radio that existed in Wanda's world to try and get a message out to her to find out, you know, why it is this was happening to her. At that point, they still believe that someone was doing this to Wanda, which is why, you know, Jimmy sends out that message of, you know, who's doing this to you, Wanda? But in actuality, it seems as though she seems to be in control of the situation. And again, we do get yet another insight into what was really going on from the first episode at the very end, where we saw those end credits, and we did see, you know, the camera panning out to reveal this S.W.O.R.D notebook and this S.W.O.R.D screensaver, and it turns out the person who was taking the notes was Darcy, which is a nice touch. I really enjoyed that. A lot of people guessed that, but I just loved seeing that confirmation. And on top of that, it seems as though that Darcy has figured out that because each of these episodes of WandaVision focus on a particular decade, they need to get the TVs from that decade in order to watch these episodes. Now, I don't know why that would be the case. Okay, it makes the poster make sense, I guess, but I don't know practically why that would be the case. Perhaps they're just making it up as they go along. But it is a cool visual, I have to admit. Like, it's a cool visual to see all those TVs stacked up there. But another thing that Darcy is able to notice, because once again, she is doing all of the heavy lifting, okay? She's doing all of the hard work here, but I digress. Another thing that she's able to notice are all of the weird jump cuts, all of the weird edits. At first, when she watches the scene between Wanda and Dottie, she thinks it's a mistake, like she thinks her eyes are playing tricks on her. But later on, when she sees that scene once again, only this time it's from episode 3, where Monica has been yeeted out of Wanda's house and out of her dimension, Darcy comes to the conclusion that it may be some sort of censorship. Like, just like a TV show would have in reality, there are certain things that Wanda, or maybe whoever's controlling her, may not want any viewers to see. And this actually made me change my perspective of Wanda as a character in this series, because up until this point I've been thinking of her as kind of this main character, but in actuality she reminds me more of a showrunner. Like, she reminds me more of someone who kind of runs the entire show. She's written the show, she's in charge of everything to do with the set design, to do with the script, to do with the actors, and of course you have the cast of characters who are kind of this, you know, bottom tier in terms of the power structure here, and they're just reading their lines, like they're just smiling for the camera, they're just doing their bit, doing their roles, and Wanda is there kind of pulling all of the strings. But I do believe that there is an executive here. I do believe that there's an executive producer or some sort of suit who is in control of even Wanda still, even though the very last part of this episode was crazy. It was scary as hell, because yes, we got to see Wanda in all her true glory. She was frightening. Elizabeth Olsen did the job. She did the actoring. She did the job that she needed to do. Truly, it was phenomenal, because we finally got to see an alternate perspective of what happened to Monica at the end of last week's episode, where she was yeeted out of the dimension. That key moment, that key scene that we weren't able to get when Vision was outside talking to Agnes and Herb. That moment is what was missing from last week's episode, and we got to see it in its full glory here, and it was chilling. It was frightening, because Wanda turns to Monica and she says, "How did you know about Ultron?" And Monica's just trying to back away, like, I don't know anything, I'm just your neighbor, like, I don't know what's going on. She's trying to kind of take back what she said, and Wanda isn't having any of it. She doesn't even blink when she says Ultron. Like, she is fully aware of what's going on, which leads me to believe that she's not as kind of dazed and confused as she may seem to be, especially from the first 3 episodes. She's fully aware of what's going on here, or at least to some extent. Now, I do think that there was perhaps a moment where she seemed confused or a little bit out of it when she did use her powers and force Monica out of there, and afterwards she was kind of looking at her hands like, whoa, I didn't mean for it to go that far. But I do think she meant to do something about it. So like I said, Monica did end up getting yeeted out of Wanda's dimension, and it seemed to me like kind of a metaphor for breaking the 4th wall, because she is smashed right through that wall. She smashed right through that wall, and she ended up entering the real world outside of Wanda's imaginary one. So it would make sense if that was a kind of reference to breaking the 4th wall. I don't know if she broke through 4 specific surfaces. She perhaps could have, because there were quite a few fences, and then there was the final kind of wall of the force field. So maybe it was a pretty on the nose metaphor for that, but I just found that to be quite funny. But when she lands outside and everyone's gathering around her, she says very explicitly that Wanda is the one who's doing all of this. Now, I personally think that this is somewhat of a red herring. I think she may believe that Wanda is in charge of all of this, but I don't think Wanda is 100% in control here. I do still think that someone has a little bit of an edge over her and wants something out of all of this. But afterwards, we revert back to Wanda and we see Vision returning like he did in the previous episode after his conversation outside. But this time, This was the closest to like a genuine jump scare that the MCU has given us. Like, I can't think of a time where I was literally jolted out of my seat in anything else in the MCU, because this was creepy as hell. We see Vision in all of his End of Avengers Infinity War glory. He is all grey. He has a massive crater on his head. His eyes are vacant because he's literally the Walking Dead. Like, he's literally a zombie Vision. He's zombie Vision. It was crazy. I was like, oh my god, this is what's really happened. This is what's really going on here. This is the reality that's seeping into Wanda's imaginary world. Is this what she sees when she looks at him all the time? Or is it just because Monica distracted her for that moment, so she wasn't able to keep up that illusion, the way that I talked about in my previous review? Like, maybe it is just that distraction that made her see him for what he really looks like, because when she kind of covers her eyes the first time and then she looks back at him, he returns to normal. So I do think that that distraction kind of hinders her powers a little bit, which may come in handy when you're trying to defeat her, perhaps, just to remember that. But I do think that that moment was striking. There were so many striking moments this episode. This one, though, visually was one of the most striking of the entire series so far. But then the episode ends with an all too familiar scene with Wanda and Vision holding their twins and sitting on the sofa to watch TV, and the aspect ratio changes once again to signal to us that we've returned back to the imaginary world of WandaVision, and that's where the episode ends. And at that point, I'm gasping. I'm left flabbergasted, because that seemed like a 2-minute episode. That seemed so short in comparison to what I thought it was going to be. These episodes are so damn short, and as things are kind of ramping up and we're really starting to fill up every single episode with a ton of information, it seems to me that they need to be getting longer at least. Like, we need to be given a little bit more than these crumbs, than the crumbs that we're being fed. How am I supposed to survive on this for the whole week? Like, please, Marvel, give us more. Like, the runtime says that it's 36 minutes, but most of that, like half of that, is literally just credits, and no after credit scene either. So it's very little time. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on WandaVision episode 4, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.